Good
You.
morning. I'm good. I'm good. I am wearing my memorial T-shirt to the Kansas City airport, the greatest airport ever created, which is
No.
no more. And we're going to
Oh.
have a sad about it, but that's okay. We have a new airport, and I guess that's all right.
Yeah,
Are,
but that
are
airport looks like Epcot Center.
it does look like Epcot Center, doesn't it? Right? Well, so it was brilliantly designed for 1971.
Right. Right.
Because when I was reading about it, the entire design was like the planes park out here and the cars go in the roundabout inside. So you literally, your car pulls up literally, and you could look through and see your plane from
Right.
your car.
Right.
And so, like,
Somebody was ambitious.
when I was a kid, you would get out of the car and literally walk onto the airplane,
Hmm.
like with nothing in between you and the airplane. You
Right.
it would
Right.
just, and that was the design. Like it was supposed to be super efficient.
Right. Hmm.
And then they opened it, and 6 months later was the first hijacking, and it immediately started to like fall apart. Like the whole idea of it fell apart,
Right. Right. Right.
basically immediately. But obviously, the past I guess 20 years now, it has been not the most efficient airport.
Yeah.
uh,
That's.
so we finally have a modern one, and but I mourn this because, like our friend Brian Puckett, when he came the first time to visit, he was like, "Well, how will I find you in the airport?" And I was like, "Oh no, I'll see you." And he was like, "What do you even mean by I'll see you?" And I was like, "No, I'll literally see you at your gate and wave at you."
Yeah.
And he was like, "How could that be?" And then he understood when he got here.
Right.
So
Yeah. That is something I often think about. I often think about that. The
the alternate universe where shit's cool.
well, no, really, like how like people's attempts at making cool shit, right? And
Oh,
like when governments get involved, it's just sort of like a full steam ahead, like a bulldozer, right? That just plows through whatever's in the way, which for better or for worse, right? So like they, once once they put money behind that airport, that was it for the next 30, 40 years, right? It's
right?
just like.
Like who
um,
had $3 billion laying around to build a new one or whatever it cost? I don't remember,
Right.
but
So it's just
yeah.
like, and so I think of that a lot. Like when I've mentioned this before on the show, like driving to Lower Wacker, which is the underground highway in Chicago,
Yeah.
which is just like the most disastrous. It's the most disastrous thing ever. And every time I end up doing a set of shows in Chicago, and like in the city proper in the loop, I end up on this highway. I end up on this underground highway, and it's always just such a pain. It's like another world down there.
Yeah.
Um, but like,
Is it
and I
one
want,
that you get like trapped on it and then there's like no way out of the tunnel?
yeah, right. So you
Oh,
go, yeah, yeah. It's so bad. It's so bad. And then the GPS
it has
tells
no
you
idea
that
where you are.
it has no idea where you are. So it tells you, but it always suggests that you use it, but it doesn't make it clear sometimes it's that you're getting onto it. And so like,
Yeah.
yes is like, take no one's on Lower Wacker right now, so you should use that highway as opposed or that set of roads as opposed to just being above ground. It's like no one's on it because no one's GPS is connected to Google right now because
Right.
they're all underground. So yeah, it's just like I don't know. Like I appreciate the ambition. Like
Yeah.
that's where I have to leave it, right? Because being just frustrated with life all the time it can take a toll. So it's like I appreciate the ambition.
Yeah.
I'll endure this for this moment and just think like, man, whoever designed this sure had a set on him.
Yeah.
Like, but anyway, Anyway, so today we're here and we're going to talk about training. So like
Yeah.
we spent a lot of time talking about training. We spent a lot of time talking about programming, self development, mindset. Man, like the sky's the limit when it comes to um, ways that we could attack the topic. But today I wanted to focus our attention on specific types of training, like club training. So
Right.
like how we organize. I mean, it could be club and it could be private one-on-one coaching. Um, but generally, the idea of how to organize our training to optimize the use of everybody's time, right? Like, what are we going to get the most out of? What's going to be the most valuable? And
Yeah.
sort of, there's a lot of presumptions in there, right? So
So many.
we can go into some of the considerations. But we've also spent a lot of time on this. So like, I don't want to get too bogged down and so there's like, so we'll get these out of the way, right? So there's a consideration of HEMA, right? So the idea that part of what we're offering is like how we're connecting our physical movement in a modern three-dimensional space to a historical art, right? Like how we're like that's a part of our project, right? And so that's going to be something to consider. And then also there's the question that we addressed, or we kind of broached last week, which is the idea that we are philosopher swordsmen, that
Right.
we're using this practice as a way of grounding all of our experience
Yeah.
and to develop ourselves in as much of a holistic way as we can. And so
Right.
like those two things are super important, and we've spent a lot of time with them, and we can nod at them as we're having this discussion. But I want to kind of focus the discussion, or at least not like get bogged down in those topics, right? So today we're going
Yeah.
to talk about like training, the like
Yeah.
everything training. So like various methods, for example, drilling
Sure.
versus games,
Sure.
versus non-cooperative drilling versus cooperative drilling, um,
Hmm.
and a bunch of other ways that have been talked about in a lot of literature that's been making its way around HEMA circles for the last several years, or just like sports science, all of that type of thing.
For sure.
And I want to talk about what you do, what we do, and sort of how it is that what it is that we're considering when we're programming our training,
Mm.
etc. Right? Like
Hmm.
we get like
Right. That's a whole
So
podcast.
right, for sure. We did one. So we talked about like a brand new student, right? You had a brand new student walk in the door, and we talked about what it was that how you attacked that problem initially, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of an assessment. So we can begin there. We can begin with assessment, and then let's get into some of the various things that we do in our clubs. I'll begin. I'll let you begin.
I do a lot of various things. Yeah. So I mean, with the setup you've given, how do I want to think about it? I will say that I think, and we're going to talk about like physical realities of what we're doing and how we're working with people for sure. But I want to start by like peeling back the layers of the onion when we lay out cooperative drilling versus non-cooperative drilling versus games versus internal martial arts medicine work meditative spaces versus, right? And I think it's easy to be like, okay, I was at this class and I really liked it, and I'm going to frame what we did as this and then set up a straw man that's the opposite, that is that, and then I'm going to go argue about it on the internet with other people that train, right? And so like what is a cooperative drill versus a non-cooperative drill, right? And I think people straw man the shit out of both sides of those until they're utterly meaningless to what anybody actually does in their class, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some people do take these things to an extreme, which is nonsensical. But for me, I focus on creating, whether it feels more like a game or feels more like a drill. To me, that's a very blurred line as well. I like to try to make all of the inputs have realistic context. And what I mean by realistic isn't like on the streets realism, but sensible context, right? So I don't know. If I want you to work against I don't know, long point, I hold my sword out in front of me with my point at you, and I want you to get to work against that, and I put literally zero energy, so it's just a floppy noodle out there. Like, what context is this representing that helps anybody? Probably none, right? It doesn't help me, it doesn't help you, etc.
Well, no, I might say that's that particular context is realistic enough, and as much as that's something that you might encounter, right? So
sure.
Like, now you wouldn't want to spend too much time on it because you won't encounter it very often. Right?
I guess,
But it does actually do. I mean, it does happen. But to your point, right? The idea is like, what are we? So before we think about what we're going to do to train,
sure,
we have to think about the environment that we're training for.
Right.
So,
right.
So whatever it is, right, exactly. Yeah. Whatever it is that we're trying to develop within ourselves, at whatever level of development that we're on, we have to have a sense of the sort of the application. I want to say, like, I want to say the ultimate application, but I don't mean that. I only mean that in terms of the way that we're framing the thing to its level of proficiency that we are interested in achieving. Right. Okay. So like when I say the ultimate application, I don't mean that this action or this technique or whatever is as polished as it could ever need to be. Right. I don't mean that, right? Because I think we both believe that that's not a thing, right? Like, you don't, right?
Yeah.
You can always make something better, and it's just a question of what you want to make better, right? And then until eventually your body just stops doing things better, right? But
yeah.
But anyway, so we say like, okay, this is a skill that we want to be able to perform.
Right.
So we say like, what is the application that we're looking to attain proficiency in, right?
Sure.
So that might be, I want to be able to perform this technique in a context in which my training partner can feed me various stimuli, and I am isolating one particular stimuli given one set of conditions to perform this technique, right? Like, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to choose that stimuli out of a set and perform this action in time, in rhythm, with feeling.
Right.
We say, like, it could be great. It could be like, not as well executed or whatever, but like, let's say that's my training goal, right?
Sure.
So then we take it back and then we figure out how do we design our training environment to lead us to that eventuality, right? Which is our
right. Right. Yeah, and I think, like, I mean, I'm trying to think about even less complex situations because, frankly, fencing is fucking hard and complex. It's not a simple thing to talk about or to do. Especially for the kind of conversations we're having. But like, if I want to teach a kid to catch a ball, like that, let's do that because that's easy to talk about.
Right.
Right? Like, obviously, the ball, they need to understand what they're doing.
Right. So
to start.
So if we use this baseball analogy, right?
Let's do this.
Okay.
Playing catch.
So you could say, all right, here's our, like, you could take a kid and you say, welcome to the baseball team. Here's the goal. You need to be able to field this ground ball and throw it to first quickly.
There it is. There
right?
it is. Quickly, efficiently, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then, but then it's like, okay, kids it doesn't even know what first is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Never held a glove. Can't throw. Right. It's like, before we start trying to field this ground ball, right, which implies there's a batter, which implies there's a pitcher, which implies there's a game going on, and throw it to first, which implies that you understand the nature of the game, right? How about we play catch?
Yeah.
Right? Can you catch the ball? No,
right.
You can't. You get hit in the face. Great.
Every time.
Right?
Yes.
So I guess so step one is sort of, as a coach, figuring out and this is what I mean when I say ultimate application, right? I don't mean like the pinnacle of your ability. I just mean like, okay, like what is the training, what is the environment that we're sort of looking at? Right? And then we say, okay, what is the level of skills that this person has in this moment?
Right. Right. And you might start the kid like in the infield, like tossing the ball along the ground, because then it isn't going to do that weird popping up and hit you in the face bullshit that it does out in the outfield, right? And like you're gonna gradually add these pieces of complexity, but you aren't going to be like, hey, this is our goal to throw it there after you get it, and just fucking start lobbing it at them and praying they work it out.
Right. So I'm going to revisit this quote that you already brought up, Brian, today. We were talking about tournaments, and we were talking about, for a lot of people, tournaments are a fire hose of shit that I'm not good at. And that's like my favorite quote ever, right? Like, the last thing that we ever need to do, I think like the first principle of an effective training mode is to not hose people down with a fire hose of shit that they're not good at.
Right.
So regardless of whether or not we're drilling, we're moving through the basic movement pattern, we're interacting with the environment, I think the goals for the person need to be like measurable.
Yeah.
And attainable.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. And that goes to, you mentioned assessment, right? And whether we're self-assessing or our coach or our training partners are assessing us, or a little bit of both, is what's usually happening, right? There has to be that period of assessment. Like, where are we at? Do you have, I don't know, some sort of physical limitation that you're not going to be springing with a crumpau, but you need to learn a crumpau.
Mm-hmm.
So do I need to get a spring into you, or do I need to get you crumping in a way that you'll have some amount of success, without the best footwork? What are we bringing in? How are we playing that? And that's all in the assessment phase, right? Because arguably you need to, bring all of those pieces up, but in what order, at what time, how do they get brought up? Like I think that's where people get into the weeds about it,
Right.
Like there's one right way.
Right. Well, there's an art, I think, right? Like coaching, training, developing yourself, all of those are their own art, right? So like
for sure.
So art is defined by the choices that we make, right?
Sure.
So, and there are correct, or we say correct, but sort of the difference between good art and bad art would be like the correctness or the efficacy of the choices that you make to achieve the goal that you're looking to achieve, right? So like, and there's no right way, right?
Yeah.
There's no right way. There's what you bring to the table and the choices you make.
Right. Yeah.
And so like, so let's talk about games. So let's talk about games versus drilling.
Right.
And what the benefit of games are, and then what the benefit of drilling is. And how we kind of how we analyze them side by side. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're going to think about that, let's think about it in terms of language acquisition. Because again, like fencing's too fucking hard, right? But if we think about, many people want to frame a drill as being a rote memorization process, right? Yeah. So you're not really engaging your creativity. You're not really engaging much of anything. You're simply, again, this is an extreme framing, but it gets framed this way in conversation, right? So the equivalent of you handing me 10 Spanish words and being like, memorize these and I'll see you next week, right? And like, so what do? I read over them a bunch. I maybe flashcard myself, right? So if that's a drill, then a game could be any sorts of thing, but the idea would be that it would be engaging a creative use, or our own mental creativity, an idea of fun, right? An idea of exploration, right?
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So there's two things. So there's art and there's play. So
sure.
So those are distinct, but they often kind of most often go hand in hand, right? Like, so it's like it's possible to engage in art without engaging in play, right?
Yeah.
Right, because you can be making all of the choices that how they're going to play out, and that's why you choose them, because you're looking to achieve a goal in this moment, right? Versus you make choices with the intention of discovery, right? Like, so my goal isn't to achieve the goal, to achieve something else necessarily. My goal is to expose myself to how my choices play out in the real world.
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
But the point is that that we're talking about drilling versus and so drilling, we're sort of thinking of drilling, or at least at this most basic level, we're thinking of drilling as, or you're sort of framing the way that a lot of people think about drilling as rote memorization, right?
Right.
I'm not applying my creativity. I'm not engaging in play. I'm really just putting in the reps.
Right. And devoid of context.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. A lot of people frame it that way. And so that's why I wanted to just like deal with that as the framing.
Yeah.
That occurs in a lot of our conversation about this.
Yes. I see. Yeah. Because if we're gonna treat drilling that way, if we're gonna draw a box and put the word drilling in it, and then we're gonna define it as being that, right? Then there is certainly diminished utility, right? Like there is some utility to that basic program, but it loses its power very quickly.
Yes. Right.
What was that?
Sorry, it was my ridiculous phone that I apparently don't have the sound.
I love that so much. My favorite.
So I'll work on that. But I feel like, James, and I'm not going to frame it properly, but do you think that there's a musical equivalent to, again, this framing of drilling, which is extreme, being like, do your scales, right?
Yeah, no, actually. So I don't know when you had that insight, but I definitely had that insight after I heard your phone go burp, burp. I was like, oh wait, music, right? So like music is exactly like so. So if we like turn to other practices, right? We say, how do experts in other fields train?
Sure.
Right? How do they develop their abilities within their practice? So most high-level musicians, let's say working musicians, or elite performers within the domain of music, will regularly work on basic movement patterns.
Yes.
Just as its own, like as its own activity, that where they remove art from the equation.
Right. Yeah. You're not trying to necessarily play with all of the artfulness required to do a song well. You're maybe just working on whatever the chord progression as it is, and where your fingers are. And
so what in music we have a term. There's two terms that they're interrelated. One of them is called woodshedding, and the other one is called chops. So they come from each other. So the story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. It's probably apocryphal. But the story is that Charlie Parker, when he was between the ages of, I don't know, it was 16 and 20 or 18 and 22, it was like for 4 years, he just decided that he was only just going to play music for 16 hours a day.
Right.
And where did he do it? He did it in his woodshed, right? So he had a woodshed on his property, and because anyone playing the saxophone for 16 hours a day is gonna, right? I don't know if it was 16
Everyone
or 4.
wants to murder them.
Right, exactly. I don't know if it was 16 or 4. I don't, lots of people have different stories of how this went, but the bottom line is, he went into his woodshed and worked on his chops. So chops are what we're talking about in terms of like your ability to perform a scale, we'll say. So in jazz, there are about an infinite number of scales, and Charlie Parker practiced all of them to the highest degree of proficiency. Right? That was his thing. And so that's not exactly true. He was a little bit more limited than some of the later people. But the bottom line is, he went in, he practiced his scales. You go in and you just do your scale. You do it. Yeah. And then you do the next one, and then you do the next one until you're done with that all of the various permutations of that across the notes available to you on your instrument. And then you do the next scale. And then you can practice them in different ways. So you can go like 1, 3, 2, 4, etc. Whatever you're doing. Those are scale degrees. And in those moments, you're not necessarily playing with art. You could play with art, right? Which is to say that you could say, I'm going to play this scale using this type of dynamic control, or I'm going to, like that would be playing with art. But there are times where it's appropriate to just do the movement patterns. Just do them. Just do them. Because the thing is, it's a complex thing to play music. And especially when you're Charlie Parker playing like incredible jazz music, it's a super complex thing. And you don't need to be fumbling over yourself on these scales when you're trying to make your art.
Right. Well, and I'm even thinking about like on a even, well, maybe not a more basic level, but like a thing that blew my mind trying to learn uke is like, in order to make that chord happen, you have to push down these strings in these places. Okay. What fingers are doing that? There's like a bass, like everyone recommends these fingers are in these places. But if you're learning a specific song that goes from one chord to another chord, you might choose to frame all of that totally differently to make the progression easier.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
And so there's no fucking rules, which for someone like me frustrated me. I mean, there are rules.
There are rules, Right. No, but you're
But like a little bit, as a beginner, it feels like, holy shit, it's all just,
Well, right. So the way that you might attack that, is you might say, okay, I'm going to play this chord, and I'm just going to see if I can play this. I'm going to go from nothing to this chord, this chord. I'm just going to do that for 5 minutes a day until I can just do that whenever I want to, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, I'm going to go from this chord, this other chord, to this chord, right? Whatever it is.
Right.
And you do that until you can just do it whenever you want. And the way, like the first way I might start attacking the problem is just that, right? Like I'm going to learn all the chords of the song, and then I'm just going to go from one to the other. And eventually I might learn the easier way, right? Like I might, and because that's essentially why you might change, right? Is because there are ways that you can do it that are easier, but enough, to go from one to the other. But, sort of just learning, there's never any harm in just putting in the work to do the hard thing.
Yeah. Right. Like I'm making myself do a D chord like the hard way instead of thumbing it. Like it'd be really easy to just throw my thumb across 3.
Right. And maybe later in your practice you make that, you decide that that's going to be best because of whatever, right? But like just getting good enough to do the hard one is not like there's never anything wrong with that. It's just a question of whether or not that's where you want to spend your time.
Yeah.
So anyway, going back to the question of training. So we're saying like, okay, there are times and ways in which developing your chops, right? So taking a thing that you know how to do, right? That you can do to the level of proficiency that you're interested in attaining or interested in maintaining, right?
Yeah.
And then saying, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on it, devoid of context, going through the movement pattern, just so that I'm giving it the maintenance that's required so that I can have fluency when it matters.
Yeah.
Right. And there are certainly lots of areas in fencing and in music and in everything where that's like perfectly valid thing to do. Right. But sort of what we hinted at already is that like we're assuming that it's maintenance and not attainment, right? So if we're interested in attaining new skills, right? Now that's sort of, let's go back to games.
Okay.
So games as a, so we talked about drilling, and then we were going to talk about drilling versus sort of drilling. We actually do. Let's go back. So you
Even further.
said, you said drilling is often framed this way.
Yes.
We figured out what that was, and we talked about, like, if we're going to frame it that way, is there utility? And we said yes.
For maintenance.
But for maintenance, right?
Limited.
It's limited utility, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about drilling, and then we'll get into games. When it comes to attainment of new skills.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then how would we frame drilling in that sense? Should, we already said we can't, like, that the program that is sort of what's normally sort of understood to be drilling is not the best for attainment of new skills, the way that it's defined. But then you're sort of implying that there's another way that you could define drilling.
Yeah. And I mean, because when I say drill, I don't actually mean the framing we've set up, right?
Right.
So let me see if I can do this. When I say drill, when I think of drill, what I mean is there is a clear series of inputs of feeling from one known against another intended known that produces an intended result.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
That's it. That's all I mean. Right? And so, like, a drill can have its dials moved from, like, completely cooperative to,
or even,
you
like,
better be doing the thing or it's not gonna work, period.
Right.
There's, like, no friendliness in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can, the dial of intensity can be anywhere. The dial of speed can be
Mm-hmm.
anywhere. And that a good use of a drill that I might write out: Coach Oberhaus, student Zornhaus, coach is soft, coach gets thrusted, right? Like, that's a drill. But my God, if you don't think there's a lot of feeling, distance, measure, etc. to play with inside that, like, I would advise you to get imaginative,
Yeah.
Because my God, even that is a hard drill.
Well, yeah. So, and the thing is, when you're, so what I like the framing. For me, a good, so for me, I actually don't think it's a drill. I think it becomes a game if we don't have, okay. So we have a sort of opening configuration, and then we have a stimulus.
Yeah.
And then we have consequences. Okay.
Sure.
So for me, I feel like if any of those things are open-ended, it's not a drill anymore.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And so what do I mean by that, right? So, if your training partner is, so let's say you're doing the drill that you just suggested.
Sure.
Right. And let's just begin with an opening configuration of both fencers are both fencers are in Vomtag, right? So
sure.
swords on the shoulder or up by the head, right? So okay. So if you can throw the cut out of range, right, then the drill is already more complex than we started.
Sure.
right? So we need we need to decide on a distance before you know what I'm saying? Like if you can throw the cut out of range, now all of a sudden I'm not just drilling my ability to perceive hard and soft. I'm drilling my ability to perceive distance as well. And so like that should be set up in the initial configuration, right? Does that make sense?
Oh
So
yeah,
like
no. You're just stripping away areas of ambiguity.
right, exactly. And I think that a good drill has the smallest number the smallest degree of ambiguity, right? Like the best drill has very clear stimulus, very clear consequences.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other thing too is that like, so drilling can be solo. So it could be just, I'm doing the movement pattern. One of the problems with solo drilling is that it's hard to get consequence in solo drilling. Right. So like if you're supposed to thrust in a strong way and you don't have a training partner putting pressure on your sword so that you can maintain your strength through your thrust, then it's hard to check to see whether or not you're thrusting strong enough, right?
Yeah.
That your point is strong enough to not be displaced by a small action, right? So like when you're doing the basic movement pattern, there's just nothing that can be done. You just have to do it until your body can kind of approximate what it looks like. But eventually you do need a training partner to say like, let's check to make sure your thrust is strong, right? And then you start thrusting and I'm just applying minimal pressure on the middle of your sword and I'm stabbing you in the face in your own thrust. It's like, you're not thrusting strong enough. You have to make sure that you're keeping your sword strong throughout the section. Okay. So the drill needs to have clear stimulus, right?
Yeah.
And then a clear outcome that demonstrates, the efficacy of that, right? Does that make sense? So like if we're going back to music, it's like, it's easy. You play the chord. Does it sound like a bag of ass? Because if it does, then you didn't do it right. Right? So
and what did you do wrong? And then you have to diagnose.
Exactly. And that's the important thing, right?
Yes.
Is that if you don't have consequences, then there's no way to actually assess whether or not you're performing the thing well enough, right?
Right. Like imagine me trying to play my uke with like noise canceling earphones in and I can't hear what I'm doing. Like
it would literally just be a waste of time, right? Like there's no you need feedback.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So and I think this is why shade gets thrown at drilling.
Yeah.
Right.
Now you're on it. Let's go.
Right. Well, so the assumption with drilling is that there's no feedback.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Well, yes. That cooperative means whatever you do, you get to win.
Yeah.
Win being hit the coach usually. Right. Yeah.
And that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent of saying when we do cooperative drilling, you're just going to put noise canceling headphones on, and you just get to feel good about whatever chord you play.
Right. And then of course, because all things are best shown in their opposite, right? Like then the idea, the shade that gets thrown the other way is that an uncooperative drill or just sparring or whatever,
or a game. We might say like a game. The way that I define.
Yeah, this wouldn't be the game as the opposite. Like the opposite would be you handed me a deliberately mistuned uke and then told me I had to find a way to make the chord work.
Right.
But that I couldn't tune the uke.
Okay, yeah, I see.
Right? And if you got good enough, you'd work it out, And of course, because certainly I've been in clubs that played that way.
Right. So
and they thought that was useful. And I don't find that useful.
No. I think that's right. So, so we might say, if we're thinking about, so another objection that we get to this sort of method of drilling, so we've already established that drilling does not mean, or cooperative, quote unquote, cooperative drilling. I don't even like that distinction. Like for me, it's drilling in games and practice.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. I'm with you, but like we had to like lay these out because they get brought up all the time.
They do. Right. So cooperative drilling must mean, for it to be effective, for like the way that we're both sort of framing this right now or defining it, for cooperative drilling to be effective, the coach needs to provide the type of stimulus that poor performance will result in a negative consequence for the person doing the exercise, right? Like they will actualize some kind of failure. Right?
Yeah. Right? Yeah. If you don't put your glove down before the ball gets to you, the ball will go between your feet.
Yeah, right. It's right. Like you have to have that, right? And okay, so this actually gets to, it's funny. There was that video I shared with you a couple of weeks ago of the guy who did this thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we did this last week.
Yeah, we did. Right. And it's like, you need to like, if you're not trying to do a thing, then what are you doing? Right? Like you're trying to do a thing. And if just like whatever you do counts as a win, then what is going on? What are we?
Right. So, and yes, so we have framed this that you are getting consistent, reasonable, accurate as much as possible input from your partner,
right,
with regards to a specific variable that you're fucking with in your drill.
Exactly.
And that for a drill to be good, you're trying to isolate very few, probably one thing that's getting fucked with.
Yeah. And so and then we might call that a target skill.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So we might say, like, in our drill, we are targeting something.
Right.
If we're not targeting something, if we're not isolating for a specific variable, right, then then that sort of gets back to my initial sort of discussion about, like, we need to have clear boundaries on this thing that we're doing. Otherwise, it's not a drill. We're in game territory. If we're not isolating for one variable, if we're isolating for, or if we're allowing for several dimensions to be fucked with, and for us not to have a clear, like, on a piece of paper, these are the things, right? That's game. That's play.
Yeah.
Right? It's a different thing, which we're going to get to tremendous value in, right? But it's a different thing.
Right.
Okay. So then the other thing that gets brought up is that, well, that might not be effective for the coach. So when I say coach student, all of my students, and any place that I do any kind of training, all of my paired partners have a coach student relationship that rotates back and forth, and there's no seniority or a level of ability. None of that factors in, right?
Same.
Right. The only prerequisite.
We're using this to differentiate rules in the drill because there are clear rules in the drill, and neither coach nor student are ignorant.
Exactly. Now there is a degree to which a coach may be limited in terms of what they can perform, and so in those cases, we don't strip them of the role, right? We don't say, like, okay, you can't be the coach anymore because you can't effectively give this stimulus or perform the action that creates the stimulus. It just means that we have to either train you up to be able to do that, right? So then we reverse the roles for long enough for them to get trained up to be able to do that, right? Or we just say, the only thing I want you to do is something that you can do, and
Right.
and I'll just train that because I can get utility out of that too, right? So like
Absolutely.
whatever you do, if the only thing that you're capable of doing is standing there with your sword by your side and walk and take a step forward, if that's all you can do, then that's what I'll
That's
use
what
you
we're
for
working
that.
on. Yeah.
Right.
No, and I don't think, I mean, listen, I know you and I are on the same page on this, but like, there is there's no such thing as too fundamental of a drill for me.
For sure.
That's it.
For sure.
Exactly. You're like, oh no, we're just throwing Oberhaus. I'm like, I've only done this for 20 years. I need a few more. Hell yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I bet I can get it better if I shut my mind up and work on it.
Yeah.
So anyways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So we say, so there's a coach student. The problem with that paradigm is that the coach is actually training behavior, developing their skills in behaviors that will result in poor performance on their part in practice.
I don't believe that.
Tell me why.
Well, because, and I said this intentionally and on purpose, neither one of those, coach or student, is ignorant. They are both doing highly intelligent things. So even that same drill, Oberhaus, Zornhau, you've got to throw your thrust against soft pressure, but in such a way that you don't weaken yourself. Great. Perfect. Yes. So all the coach is doing is being soft and yet riding with that thrust.
Right.
In order for me, in the coach role, when I am fencing someone where I'm not trying to be soft, but I get this same feel, I know where I am.
Mm-hmm.
Because soft hard isn't it's not isolatable out of the relationship that you have with a fencing partner.
Yeah. So there's a fluency, right? There's a fluency. Yeah. So when I know how to,
when you know how to create a feel, you can create that feel. Exactly. And you can recognize that feel.
And you can choose not to. You can choose not to.
Yes.
Right? So you're gaining a fluency in this language so that you know how to speak it when it's appropriate.
Yes.
Yes. And it doesn't mean that you're condemning yourself to make that choice.
No. There is no such thing as muscle memory. I mean, I think we've all figured that out. But like, to be clear,
right.
You are always in the driver's seat of what you do. Mm-hmm. Your body does not take over and do shit for you unless you opt out.
Right. Well, and the other thing too is that like the more reps that you have in anything, right, the more fluency you have in anything, the more equipped you are to either choose to or not to do it.
Right.
Right. So the coach, there's another thing that I want to bring up too, which I like. So everything that you said so far, I'm 1,000% here for it. Right.
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
You're only
you don't have to be, but I'm glad.
You're only just going to get better by doing the wrong thing, right? Like you're only just going to get better because you're going to have a clearer picture. At the end of the day, you're going to be like, okay, I understand that stimulus, right? Like and then when you're fencing, you're like, well, I can't do that because if I do that, they're going to thrust me in the face because of the nature of this configuration. And I know that this pressure leads towards this outcome if they're paying attention. But the other thing too, and this is not the more important thing because both of them are super highly important in terms of our practice. But like what we're doing is a contest, right? What we're training for, the ultimate application of all of this training is contest in fencing with a training partner, right?
Right.
And there are three aspects of any kind of contest in game form that are worth talking about. So number one, there's execution, your physical competency to perform various tasks within the game, right? And then there's the knowledge. Okay, so the knowledge is knowing what action to choose based on the various circumstances of your environment. So the very stimulus you receive, right? Your ability to perform the right action according to the right stimulus, and time and rhythm with feeling, etc. Right, at the appropriate intensity. So if we assume perfect knowledge and execution on behalf of both contestants, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Then the invariable outcome of any fencing bout, right? If we assume perfect knowledge and perfect execution on the part of both contestants, the invariable outcome is what?
Well, it would seem to me I'm not exactly sure what you're framing, but it would seem to me that they would fence for 6 hours and then stop in exhaustion with no hits being scored.
Right. So perfect knowledge and perfect execution necessitate a stalemate, right?
Right.
Because neither fencer is like, I'm going to begin to create an advantage, and with feeling, you're going to work indes to mitigate that advantage. But if you try and use that moment to create your own advantage, then I'm going to, with feeling, work indes to mitigate your advantage. And it's going to go that way until.
And there's some Princess Bride shit in here, and we can see you studying Capaferro. And I also fence left-handed. And here we are.
But the bottom line is, right, we're assuming perfect knowledge and perfect execution. Right? Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say, here's what I'm not going to say. I'm not going to say that that's not realistic. Right? I'm not going to say that. Right? I think that's realistic. Right? There are lots of games in which that is realistic.
Sure.
There are lots of games, in which that is realistic. But there's another dimension to games, especially games that happen sort of in okay. So in the game of fencing, right, we can perform things. We can perform things before. We can begin to perform our action before we get the required stimulus to determine whether or not it's the appropriate action.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I mean is, if you give me a stimulus and I respond perfectly, I'm going to mitigate your advantage, right? But I'm not going to gain my own advantage, right?
Right.
But if I can predict your action, right, I can begin my work early.
Yeah.
And I can take my advantage that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sense in which, if we assume perfect knowledge and perfect execution, that the game doesn't necessarily result in a stalemate. But what happens is we begin to play mind games with each other.
Yes.
Right. And so the third level or the third dimension of this sort of game is interaction. The way that my behavior influences your future choices.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Oh, I'm with you.
So if I can create a situation where my behavior influences your future choices in a way that's predictable enough for me,
right,
to use that information to create advantage, then even if we assume perfect knowledge and perfect execution, we can have a winner.
Right, exactly. And I mean, this is more or less where the world of feints live, right? And this is why feints are no fucking good against a beginner.
Right.
Because they're not trying to foresee into your future action.
Right.
Because they don't have enough knowledge to do that yet.
Because they don't have enough knowledge to do that, right? Exactly. And to be perfectly honest, the execution to be able to do anything with that knowledge.
Well, that too.
Right? Right? So yes. So now let's talk about the coach and what they're developing, right? In those moments, right?
Now you're here. Yeah.
Right. So they're developing their ability to create stimuli for their training partner in a way that they understand how the training partner is going to respond, so they could use that information to choose a course of action that may otherwise be unsuccessful, right? Like they could, like, so for instance, I could give you strong pressure on the strung of your sword, right?
Yeah.
So which is winding pressure, right? Or
sure.
It's essentially it's insufficiently strong pressure, so I would just call it weak pressure on the strung of your sword. And so you, or maybe on the middle or whatever. But the bottom line is, I can create the stimulus that I know you're going to wind against.
Right? Because I have to, otherwise you're just going to hit me.
Right. But the thing is, I can do it in such a way that leaves me enough bandwidth to respond against your winding with some kind of counter wind.
You're already there because you knew it would have to.
Exactly.
It would have to follow just so. Right? I mean, this is the center of Liechtenauer's art, is constrainment. Zwingen, right? Constrain their options.
Right.
Why? Not because it doesn't mean they can't hurt you, because he's very clear they can always hurt you, right? It's so that you can get ahead.
Right.
In the prediction train.
Right. So initially, like at the most basic level, you shouldn't be trying to get ahead, right?
No.
Because your training partner might not know to wind, right? Like you don't know what your training partner knows.
Right.
But if you're interested in winning at the highest level, if you're interested in winning the bout with a training partner at the highest level or the highest degree of competency in such a way that we assume perfect knowledge and execution, then the only way that you get to win is by creating conditions that give you a better ability to predict the future.
Right. Which means, in part, like for this scenario, if I'm coaching you, James, and I give you winding pressure, and our drill is I'm giving you winding pressure, and if you wind properly, you hit me. I get to experience 500 times of the entire feeling of the wind happening to me.
Yeah.
Which means eventually I can start noticing where exactly during the feeling of this very complex motion, where exactly in this is that fuzzy place where I can grab it and counterwind.
Yeah.
Because if you go too early, you're fucked. If you go too late, you're fucked. There's only one place.
Or if you give too much pressure too quickly, you're fucked. Or if you give the pressure at the wrong part of the sword, you're fucked. Right? Like all of that.
Right? Yes. And so it lets you as the coach feel the thing you're going to counter someday.
Right.
You're not doing it right now. You're just experiencing it. You're just taking it in. Right? So if you are coaching well, you are learning so much about high-level fencing. Right?
Yeah, no, like exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. You're developing that fluency. You're developing that
you
fluency.
Have the potential to do that. Right?
Yeah, and the thing is, like, and you're also just opening the door for that. Right? Like that's the other thing too, is that, if we think about drilling, and that we sort of relegate drilling to the framing that we started with, or we think about fencing as sort of the achieving your own goal, right? Without conceiving or without considering that your behavior has the has the power to influences your training partner's future choices, right? Then you're never actually fencing. You're never fencing, right? Fencing is you're just like, you're spending all of your time just like learning how to move the pieces on the chessboard, right? Like how many times do you need to move the knight in an L shape before you get it? Like, okay, got it. Knight moves in an L shape. I'm ready to move on. The goal is to, as quickly as possible, get you to a place where you're interacting and you can experience what it is to behave a way and see how your opponent responds.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just chaos. You're not just behaving against something that you have no power over.
Right. And like and if you're in a game where there are a myriad of variables that are all getting dialed all over the place all the time, because of course people are competing, you know, in a game there's a winner and a loser, right? And so people are fucking with all the variables to try to achieve whatever the goal is. You know, it makes it hard to distinguish the relevant variables and the relevant feels from the noise of all of the things, right? And at some point you might have a competence to where that isn't noise anymore, right?
Or you could limit the nature of the game, right? So like, so let's talk a little bit, because we've really just been trying to empower drilling, right?
I mean, games might have to be the next one. This just might be drilling. I don't know.
I mean, so like I see a tremendous amount of value in games.
For sure.
And so, and I don't know, maybe you're right. Maybe it's too late to get into, because I was just gonna, I guess I was just gonna start the conversation with regards to games. I'm reminded of an anecdote that I read in a book called The Talent Code, which we should do something on at some point.
A book club on it. Yeah.
But there's a discussion of how this small town ended up producing like a high. So there are these, you know, the opening gambit of this book, The Talent Code, is this idea that there are these talent hotbeds, right?
Okay.
So like, talent can't be just something that that you are born with or whatever, or that you're genetically predisposed to, because there are places that you can go where literally every single person has like an immense amount of talent, right? So like, so how is that true? And one of the examples that he cites is I think it was Brazil, or some place in South or Central America, where there was this game. There's this talent hotbed of soccer players.
Okay.
Right? But there was a game that they played that was essentially indoor soccer.
Okay.
Right. And it was very different from regular soccer. Like the game was radically different. But for whatever reason, the people that came from this area all had incredible talent in one or two dimensions that were sufficient. Their talent was so powerful that it was sufficient to give them a net advantage just against the competition otherwise.
Sure.
And so there was a group in England, or like a club in England, or like some kind of youth club or whatever, where the coach was like, we're going to start playing this game. We're just going to play this game as a basic, like this is a basic thing that we do every day or whatever. Like we're going to play this sort of indoor soccer game that's not exactly soccer or whatever. And he watched as his students grew in competency across these dimensions, right? And so like the moral of that part of the story was the idea that like what this game provided was the ability to work on your chops contextually.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like, so it wasn't soccer, but everyone got more touches because it was indoor soccer. And so the playing field was a lot smaller. And so everyone had an opportunity to be dribbling the ball against a partner.
Yeah.
More often. Right.
Right.
And so like, that's sort of where my head is at with games. Right.
Yeah.
So like what a game can do is it can isolate for a smaller set of skills and teach you to apply proficiencies that you have in a way that's sort of more, I don't know how to put it. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'll let you.
Concentrated? Is that kind of what?
Well, so it's concentrated, but it's also, it's like with fueling indes,
yes.
right? Like more closely approximates the environment.
But still isn't the environment.
Crucially. But it isn't the environment, right? It isolates for particular dimensions of skill that are applicable or that, you know, have application in the environment.
Right. Like I'm thinking about like oftentimes we'll play like a warm-up game of like grip fighting, right? Wrestling grip fighting where you're trying to touch the opposite person's like knee or something, right? Like whatever. You're just trying to touch the knee and they're trying to stop you. And like that's all we're doing, right?
Right. And so what are you learning what are you learning in that game, right? You're learning distance, you're learning movement, you're learning fueling, right? Because you're feinting and you're working indes in those moments, right? Like if you just reach out and grab the knee, they're going to pull their knee away. So you have to do something else, right? Exactly.
And they tend to pull the knee away in a predictable manner, and you can start to predict that after you've done enough, and then you can start to use that to your advantage. And
exactly. Right. So like, and this gets into play, and so I guess we really should just do games next week.
Let's do games next week.
So yeah, because there are a tremendous amount of games, and really like what I want to, you know, we can talk about play. So there's a difference between so when we're drilling, we're sort of, I think the way that we've established this here is that we're trying to remove, at least at the most basic level, we're trying to move as much play from it as possible, right? It's like, I'm doing a thing. If I don't do it well, it's not going to work.
It will fail.
So it will fail. It has to fail. If there's no consequence, it's not useful at all, right?
Right.
Okay. Ooh, let's talk real quick about this though. And we already mentioned it, but should you drill something without consequence initially, right? So like,
well, and so I was thinking we would get more into this in the games discussion next week, but I think one thing that is needs to be highlighted is people's internal tendencies towards motivation. Some people are highly motivated to win the moment they're told they could win or lose. That turns them on and makes them, we'll say, study what they're doing in a higher fashion or a better fashion. Some people find that to be threatening,
intimidating
in a way that turns them down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, games are easy, but I think that's also true in drilling. Some people are not turned on because there isn't a win.
Sure. Well, and then also like some people might get like overwhelmed by even what we would consider like to be the most basic thing, right?
Correct. Like, so for some people, like the consequence, you have to turn it all the way down
And
because
that's
they're a
the thing.
toddler.
That's the thing. So like, and that's kind of where I wanted to get to. It's not that we say there's no consequence, right? That's
Correct.
not what we're saying.
There
right?
has to be a consequence.
There has to be a consequence. But the thing, because otherwise it's like exactly. If we're just being as logical about this as we can, there
Right.
is always a consequence, but we
Right.
can just turn it so far down. Like
Yes.
for me, coaching you right now, the consequence is you move your foot. If you can move your foot, I'm calling that a win, right?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So it's not, and like, yeah, that's assuming like incredibly low proficiency in all of the things that we're doing. But if that's where we're at, then that's what we're doing. Like, it's okay to say, like, and I don't even have to tell you that, right? As a coach, I can be like,
no,
I just want to see you move your foot. Like, if we can get you moving your foot every time, or moving the right foot in the right direction, maybe that's leveling it up a little bit. Like,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, to be perfectly honest, that's a thing that can be a struggle with some higher level fencers.
Absolutely, it can be.
Right.
Absolutely, it can be.
And so when we're drilling, we always have some consequence.
Yes.
Right. Always have some consequence, but it doesn't need to be the whole. It doesn't need to be the consequence that is
physically or emotionally catastrophic. It doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be the street consequence.
Well, and the thing is, and that's kind of where, that's what I was getting to. Like, I was thinking about like the fencing bout.
Yeah.
It necessarily can't be that, right? Like, that's what a drill is. A drill is, we're removing aspects of the practice so that we can isolate for like developing the ability to perform an action or whatever. So like, so we're always stripping the particular skill from all of its relevant context.
Yes.
Right? Until it says like, okay, you've learned to do the skill every conceivable way up until performing it in practice. And so now the only thing left is just to go perform it in practice. Right?
Right.
You know, so for instance, we might take rock climbing. Right?
Sure.
So what's the skill? Give me a skill.
Drop me. Sure.
Okay. So what's the most basic level? Like, what's the most basic competency required for you to even begin to?
Well, I mean, basic is you would have to have like the physical flexibility to even do it.
So stop there, right? So now we're just going to train flexibility. We're not even going to a wall. We're not even thinking, we're going to go to your living room and lay down and stretch out whatever frickin' thing you need to stretch out. Right?
Yeah. See if you can chicken wing your leg. If you can't chicken wing your leg, you got to work on that.
Yeah. And even as like, there's doing it passively. So like someone else stretching you out, right?
Yeah.
Or statically. And then there's doing dynamically where you're stretching yourself out, right?
Right.
All of those things need to be developed. Now, or you could just be born with that flexibility, right?
Right.
Great. We move further along the process.
Right. And you got to know when to do it and when it is beneficial to you to do it and when it isn't. Right. And how your foot has to be positioned to be able to do it. Yeah, there's so many things. This is something I'm just kind of figuring out its utility, by the way. So
sure.
That's why
but the bottom line is like, eventually it's like, okay, we went through all the various permutations. We've gone from your living room where someone is just like physically pulling your leg into position to where you can move your own leg into position while you're standing up against your own wall or whatever, to we're on a wall and we're looking at these particular holds and we're saying like, okay, that right there is where you're going to do it. Right. So you have to get there and then do it, because you're going to find that you can't, right? Because it's a new thing in a new context. And then eventually it's like, okay, we're on Red Rocks.
Yeah.
And you've got to determine in that moment what's appropriate. And it's that skill. You got to see it. You got to perform it.
Yep.
And you got to get yourself out of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And then you can say like, okay, I can do that now. But the beauty of it is, if you've gone through that whole process, right? Like you've taken it step by step and you've worked it out into, did every degree of skill development, then you just know, like, you don't need to like be proud of yourself. You won't be proud of yourself.
Yeah.
Right. You're like, I can do that. I just spent the last 6 months working on it. Of course I could.
Right. I prepared for it. So I did it,
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And you'll be like, that's kind of cool. But like, that's the level of your reward. Right.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So games next week.
Games next week. Good games, emotional consequence of games. What else do we say about it? Benefits.
Well, so yeah. So we'll get more into like isolating dimensions of skill, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about winning and losing, and how, and like what that does to people emotionally. We'll talk about interaction, how games can help develop our skills in the dimension of interaction, right? So like what we were talking about
predictable
before is like, yeah, exactly. There's the fluency of the stimulus and the consequence and the various conditions, but then there's also skills in the dimension of applying interaction.
Yeah.
So like we can get into all of that.
I love it. Right. That's amazing. All right. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.